This lecture is on Calvinism. This lecture is for the East Asia School of Theology for the church history class. In the last two lectures, we looked at the Swiss Reformation and we looked at the Radical Reformation. There is one other Reformation movement that I want us to look at now, and that is Calvinism. Calvinism is named for this man, John Calvin. Now, John Calvin was born in Noyon, France in the year 1509. John Calvin's father originally wanted John to go into the ministry, and so John began to study for the ministry. Later, John's father decided that John would be able to make more money as a lawyer. And so John moved from studying theology to studying law. Now, while studying for both the priesthood and the law, John was exposed to Renaissance humanism, just like Ulrich Zwingli was. And like Ulrich Zwingli, John was influenced by this influence of Renaissance humanism that was in the schools where he studied at. Now, his father died, and after his father died, John Calvin resumed his theological studies and he became a Protestant. Now, scholars, there is debate among scholars about when exactly John Calvin left the Catholic Church. So we don't know exactly when this happened, but we do know that he did leave the Catholic Church. In late 1534, anti-Protestant violence broke out in France, and so John Calvin fled to Switzerland to find a place of safety. Now, John Calvin was initially based in Basel in Switzerland, but then he wanted to relocate to Strasbourg. However, because of some military action, he was delayed for one day in Geneva. And during that day, he stayed with William Farel, who was a fellow French reformer. And while he was staying with William Farel spoke to John Calvin of the needs that existed in Zurich, and not in Zurich, but in Geneva. And he convinced John Calvin to stay in Geneva. And so John Calvin's long career in Geneva began. Now, for the rest of his career, John Calvin stayed in Geneva, except for a break of 3 years when he did go to Strasbourg. But then after 3 years in Strasbourg, John Calvin returned to Geneva. Now, during his years in Switzerland, John Calvin wrote his multi-volume opus magnum opus, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And one of the things that John Calvin did was he looked at different areas of theology. And so his genius was, he was a systematizer. And so he created kind of a systematic organization of all these different areas of theology. And he interpreted all of this theology from a Protestant perspective. And so this is John Calvin's great contribution to the church, his Institute of Christian Religion. John Calvin was also involved in pastoral ministry in all 3 cities where he resided. And this was despite the fact that John Calvin felt like he did not have the gift of being a pastor, but he was a pastor. And so this slide shows us a picture of John Calvin preaching at one of the churches where he was a pastor. During his years in Geneva, John Calvin grew to have enormous influence in the life of Geneva thanks to his powerful intellect and his zeal for religious reform. Together with William Farel, John Calvin worked to reform Geneva's churches. Calvin's relationship with the Geneva Council was a mixed one. At times, he had a close relationship with the City Council of Geneva, and at other times, his relationship was very stormy. And it was at one of these stormy times that Michael Cerveda arrived in Geneva, and Michael Cerveda's arrival in Geneva helped John Calvin to regain his authority in Geneva. So who was Michael Cerveda? Well, Michael Cerveda was a Spanish physician. Michael Cerveda made a number of discoveries about circulation within the human body. And so these discoveries were really significant contributions to medical knowledge. However, Michael Cerveda faced persecution in both Spain and France because of his religious beliefs. And so, like many other people at that time, he fled to Switzerland to find a safe place where he would not be persecuted for his religious beliefs. However, Michael Cerveda was considered to be a heretic, not just by the Catholics, but also by Protestants. This is because he denied certain key Christian doctrines, including the doctrine of original sin and the doctrine of the Trinity. John Calvin and Michael Cerveda did correspond with each other for a while, and they wrote each other numerous letters, both of them writing under assumed names. That way, if their letters were intercepted, no one would know who was writing these letters, because this correspondence was of a sensitive nature. Now, eventually, Michael Cerveda was arrested in Geneva, and John Calvin helped lead the prosecution against Michael Cerveda. And this was because John Calvin was trained in the law, and he had this amazing intellectual powers. So he helped lead the prosecution against Michael Cerveda. So in the end, Michael Cerveda was found guilty of heresy, and he was burned at the stake. So what was John Calvin's beliefs? Now, I'm going to oversimplify his beliefs because John Calvin did not express his beliefs in the way that I'm going to. I'm going to talk about the 5 points of Calvinism. Now, this was a formulation of John Calvin's belief that was developed later, but it is still a very helpful summary of what John Calvin believed. And the 5 points of Calvinism can be remembered by the letters T-U-L-I-P, which formed the word tulip. And so T stands for total depravity. John Calvin believed that because of the fall, all of us are born sinners, and all of us are slaves to sin. And because we are slaves to sin, none of us willingly seeks after God. It is God who seeks after us. And this leads to the next letter of tulip, U, which stands for unconditional election. And so according to this idea, before time began, before God created the universe, before God created Adam and Eve, God chose who will be saved. And in some forms of Calvinism, Some Calvinists believe that God not only chose who would be saved, but he also chose who would go to hell. So that's unconditional election. Our salvation is chosen completely by God. We have nothing to do, we have no say in whether we are saved or not. It is the complete choice, sovereign choice of God. Then we have the third point of Calvinism, which is L, the letter L, which stands for limited atonement. Now, limited atonement says that Christ died only for the elect, although his death is sufficient to save everyone if that were God's will. Okay, so Calvinists would say, yes, Jesus' death is sufficient for everyone, but God did not choose everyone to be saved. Therefore, his death is sufficient only for the elect. The fourth point of Calvinism is symbolized by the letter I, which stands for irresistible grace. And what this says is those whom God chooses to be saved will definitely be saved. And where there is resistance to God's saving will, God's Spirit will overcome any such resistance. And then the last point of Calvinism is represented by the letter P, which stands for perseverance of the saints. And this point says that those whom God has chosen to be saved can never lose their salvation. And sometimes people will also restate this point as once saved, always saved. So these are the 5 points of Calvinism. There is a lot more to it, but these 5 points give us a very brief and concise summary of what John Calvin believed. Now, beginning in John Calvin's day, and continuing long after his death, Calvinism spread throughout Europe and beyond. Collectively, all churches and denominations that have Calvinist doctrine are known as Reformed churches. So the first of these Reformed churches would be the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians began in Scotland with John Knox. And today, Presbyterians can be found all over the world, including the United States, Mexico, Brazil, Malawi, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, Korea, Taiwan, India, Australia, New Zealand, and Vanuatu. And in fact, my own wife is Presbyterian. So Presbyterians can be found all over the world. Another group of Calvinists that spread widely were the Huguenots. Now, the Huguenots were French Calvinists, and they experienced great persecution in France. And so many Huguenots eventually crossed the Atlantic Ocean to seek religious freedom in America. And so this painting is a painting showing some of these Huguenots leaving their native country of France to cross the Atlantic Ocean to find religious freedom. Some Huguenots also immigrated to Africa and became some of the first European settlers in South Africa. These Huguenots eventually became known as the Boers, B-O-E-R-S, or Afrikaners. Yet another group of Calvinists were the Puritans. we know them today. We sometimes know them today as the Pilgrims. And so the Puritans began in England, and they were called Puritans because they believed that the Church of England was corrupt, and they wanted to leave the Church of England and have a more pure form of Christian religion. And so, because the Church of England was the official Church of England, the Puritans were persecuted in England because they were breaking the law by not attending the Church of England. And like the Huguenots, many Puritans crossed the Atlantic Ocean to seek religious freedom in America. And these Puritans, also popularly known as the Pilgrims, established the Plymouth Bay colony, and they went on to have an enormous influence on the development of the American culture. So this group of people had an enormous influence in American history. And then there are the Reformed Baptists. And yes, there are some Baptists who are of the Reformed tradition. And so this is one of the interesting things about Baptists. I myself am a Baptist, and I remember when I was attending seminary, how some of my classmates would engage with each other in debates about predestination versus free will, Calvinism versus Arminianism. And so, in fact, the pastor of my home church in Texas, which is a Southern Baptist church, my own pastor is a Calvinist himself. He is of the Reformed tradition. I am not of the Reformed tradition, but this shows that within the Baptist tradition, you have these competing sets of beliefs. You have the Reformed tradition, and then you have the free will tradition. And so this is one of the reasons why Baptists have had conflict over the years. But this gives you a brief introduction to Calvinism and how Calvinism has spread around the world. Now I want to give you some reflection questions to think about. And I would like for you to respond to these reflection questions in our online discussion forum. So I have 3 reflection questions for you. The first question says, Ulrich Zwingli and Martin Luther were unable to agree on the question of the Lord's Supper. We talked about this at the Marburg Colloquy, okay? And as a result of this disagreement, the German and Swiss Reform movements never became united. And this is despite the fact that they agreed on everything else. But on this one issue of the Lord's Supper, they disagreed. And so because of that disagreement, they never became a united Reform movement. So the question is this: how should we deal with theological differences with Christians from other denominations and other traditions? Like, for example, I talked about how the pastor at my home church is a Calvinist, and I am not a Calvinist. So how do you deal with other Christians who have different beliefs or different traditions? Okay, the second question is this: the revolutionary Anabaptists believed it was permissible to use violence to fight against evil. Now, so in light of that, let me just give you a hypothetical situation. How would you counsel someone who asked you whether or not it is permissible to kill doctors who perform abortion? And believe it or not, this is not a hypothetical question at all. I once had someone who asked me this very question while I was living in Shanghai. A young man from Oklahoma came to me and he said, you know, Derek, abortion is wrong. It's murder. Is it right for me to kill abortionists? Okay, so I want to know how you would counsel someone like this. And I will tell you later what my own response was. The third question is this: how would you respond to persecution in your homeland? You know, we throughout these Reformation movements, we saw how some of these believers, some of these people who were, for example, who were Mennonites or Calvinists or Huguenots, how they left their homelands in Europe and they crossed the Atlantic to find religious freedom elsewhere. So the question is, would you remain in your homeland and endure persecution, or would you leave your homeland and seek religious freedom elsewhere? So please respond to these three questions on our online discussion forum, and I look forward to seeing your answers.